Carlsen and Anand are playing at the Lindores Abbey tournament, and e3 played, which is known as the Rubinstein system. Vishy castles. This is the mainline stuff. Bishop comes out to d3, and now a very normal way to play is to strike in the center with d5. Magnus takes on d5, and Vishy takes back with the pawn, opening up his bishop here on c8. Magnus puts his knight on e2. You generally try and put your knights in the center of the board, but with knight e2, you are planning to put your pawn on f3, and later the knight can go to f4. Vishy plays his pawn to b6. And now Magnus Carlsen simply castles. This is a very well-known opening position, and Anand brings his bishop back. He wants to play c5, but then his bishop would have been outside the pawn chain, so he gets it back. Magnus now is threatening knight b5 to attack the bishop and the pawn, so Vishy simply pushes his pawn to c5. Anand has this no-nonsense approach to the opening. He's castled, brought his rook on the semi-open file, brought his bishop back now here, and so it's very normal play, and you can already sense that Magnus's position is not that great. This move f3 is definitely not in the spirit of the position. You want to play f3, but the timing is a little bit off. Anand goes knight c6, and now he's putting the pressure on Magnus. King h1. You can see that the e3 pawn is slightly weak, and now Vishy goes bishop b7. This is very standard stuff for Vishy. I like Magnus's move a3. He's actually planning a deep maneuver, bishop b1 to a2. g6 prepares the development of the bishop to g7 or to h6, putting pressure on e3 pawn. Now the bishop can't really move for the time being because the c5 pawn is a bit soft. But look at this maneuver. You are now going after the d5 pawn. Vishy pushes the knight away, and maybe c4 b5 can happen pretty soon. But instead Vishy goes bishop g7. Very safe and solid play. Finally Magnus chops off the pawn on c5. Pawn takes c5. And now if you play knight a4, I can push my pawn to c4. So he plays bishop e1. Notice that the pawn here is hanging. In fact, Vishy can take it, but instead goes for the more aggressive move d4. Magnus goes knight a4. He says, you want to take this pawn, take it, but I am going after the c5 pawn. Anand plays a slightly dubious move, knight d7, and now there's a tactic. Can you find it? Magnus has 5 minutes on the clock, and he spots it. Bishop takes f7. What a move. King takes f7, and the idea is that the loose piece on b3 on b7 is attacked by the queen on b3. Vishy moves his king, and the bishop falls. Here pawn takes e3, and black is still in the game, but instead Anand takes with the rook. He wants to attack this knight on e2. The knight now has to move. The c5 pawn is hanging, but taking it would lose the piece on e2, so he goes knight to g3. And now Vishy goes knight e5, but it's a mistake because the rook is kind of getting trapped here. He plays his bishop to d2. Fantastic move. The rook cannot go back, so it has to go to d3. But now this bishop is hanging, so you need to defend it, and knight e4 is a fantastic move, defending the bishop, threatening queen a6. So rook b8 played, and now you can actually take this pawn on a6, but Magnus is very safe. He goes queen d5. Finally Anand says, I don't want to lose my rook there, so he gives it up for the bishop. He's exchanged down. Knight takes d2, but the problems are not over. c5 is attacked twice, so knight d3 is played. Magnus has to be careful. His rook is hanging, b2 is under pressure, and also there's a threat on the f2 square. So rook to c2 played, and now 1, 2 and 3 attackers. Vishy tries to defend with another piece, but the knight comes into e4, and now there are 4 attackers on the c5 pawn. He tries to attack the queen here with knight f4, but after queen c4 it is clear that the c5 pawn is falling. Magnus plays his queen to c4. The c5 pawn is under attack, and there is no way to prevent that pawn from falling. Vishy's position is close to lost here. And with 3 minutes on the clock, he resigns the game. Magnus Carlsen wins in 31 moves.